I want to tell you about the 6 seconds of silence that followed the toast. Not the toast itself. Not the words I said. Not the moment I realized what had happened. The silence after. 6 seconds in a room of 200 people where every single person understood something that I did not. 6 seconds that I will remember for the rest of my life. My name is Natasha Volkov. I am 29 years old. I grew up in St. Petersburg, Russia, in an apartment on the 4th floor of a building that faced a canal, and in winter the canal froze, and in summer it reflected the sky, and in all seasons it was the most beautiful thing I could see from my bedroom window. I came to London 4 years ago, not because I had to, because I chose to. There is a difference, not everyone understands this, but there is a significant difference between leaving a place because it pushed you out and leaving a place because you decided on a specific Tuesday in March that the life you wanted could not be built where you were standing. I had been working at a translation agency in St. Petersburg for 3 years. Russian, English, French, I was good at it. My English was precise. Literary, even. I had read more English novels than most English people I would later meet, and I read them in English, not in translation, because I believe that a translated novel is a photograph of a painting. It captures the shape, but not the color. I arrived in London on a Wednesday in October with 2 suitcases and a job offer from a translation and communications firm in Canary Wharf that had found my CV through a professional network and offered me a position that I accepted before I had arranged somewhere to live. I found a flat in Greenwich. Small, 3rd floor. A window that faced a park instead of a canal, which was different, but not worse. I started work on the Monday. The firm was called Meridian Language Services. No relation to anything in Singapore, just a coincidence of names that I would not think about until much later. 15 people. 3 floors of a glass building. The kind of place that took language seriously as a business, which meant they understood that a mistranslation was not an embarrassment. It was a liability. I was good at the work. I was less good at everything else. This is the part that nobody tells you about moving to an English-speaking country when your English is excellent. When your English is bad, people make allowances. They speak slowly. They choose simple words. They fill the gaps for you with patience and goodwill. When your English is excellent, they assume you understand everything, including the things that are never said. I learned this slowly, over months, through a series of small misunderstandings that accumulated the way small things accumulate. Unnoticed until suddenly the weight of them is visible. I learned that we should do this again sometime does not mean we should do this again sometime. I learned that that's interesting sometimes means the opposite. I learned that I'll let you know is a complete sentence that requires no follow-up. I learned that British people apologize for things that are not their fault and do not apologize for things that are, and that the function of the apology is social lubrication rather than acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I learned all of this, slowly, carefully, the way I had learned everything in my life, by reading the room and adjusting and reading it again. What I had not learned by the Saturday in June when I stood up to give a toast at my colleague Sophie's wedding reception was the specific word that was about to end the evening. Sophie was 27, British, the most genuinely kind person I had met in London, which is a city that contains many kind people but makes kindness difficult by the specific architecture of its social distances. She had been the first person at the firm who asked me questions about St. Petersburg that were not tourism questions. Not what is it like and is it cold, but actual questions, specific questions, the kind that indicate the asker has thought about you as a person rather than as an interesting object. We had become friends in the way that you become friends in your late 20s in a foreign city. Slowly, over lunches that extended into afternoons and evenings that extended into the kind of conversations that do not need a destination, because the conversation itself is the point. She had asked me to give a toast at her wedding reception. I had been preparing it for 3 weeks. This is important. Not 3 days. 3 weeks. I had written it and rewritten it, and asked 2 colleagues to read it, and had stood in my flat in Greenwich practicing it at different volumes to understand how it would sound in a room. I had timed it 2 minutes and 40 seconds, which I had read was the optimal length for a wedding toast. I had checked every word. I had not checked one word. The reception was in a large Georgian house in Surrey that had been converted into an event venue. 200 guests, round tables with white linen. The kind of English wedding that takes place in the specific register between formal and warm. Formal enough that people are on their best behavior. Warm enough that the best behavior includes genuine emotion. I was at the head table. Sophie had insisted. The speeches came after the main course. Her father went first, then the best man. Then there was a pause. The kind of pause that indicates a change, a transition, something different coming. The master of ceremonies said my name. I stood up, I held the microphone, I looked at 200 people looking at me. And I gave the toast I had prepared and practiced and refined over 3 weeks. I spoke about Sophie, about the specific quality of her attention, the way she listened as if what you were saying was the most interesting thing she had heard all week. And the extraordinary thing was that you never felt she was performing this. It was simply what she did. I spoke about friendship, about what it means to find, in a city that is not yours, a person who makes it feel slightly more like it could be. I spoke about her new husband, James, whom I had met 6 times and who had, on each of those 6 occasions, demonstrated the specific quality that I had come to think of as the most important quality in a person. He made Sophie more like Sophie. Not less. Not different. More. I raised my glass. I said, "Please join me in raising a glass to Sophie and James. May their life together be everything they have imagined." I paused, and then I said the word. One word. At the end of the toast. A word I had chosen deliberately. A word I had looked up. A word I believed with complete confidence meant wonderful, extraordinary, worthy of celebration. In Russian, the word I was reaching for was brilliant. And the English equivalent I had chosen, the word I had researched and selected and placed at the end of my carefully constructed toast, like a final note of music, was not the word I thought it was. The 6 seconds of silence began. I saw it move across the room the way a wave moves, starting at the tables closest to me, the people who had heard most clearly, and rippling outward to the people at the back who had not quite caught it and were turning to the people beside them. I saw Sophie's mother's hand go to her mouth. I saw the best man's expression, the specific expression of a person who is trying very hard to decide whether to laugh. I saw James. James, to his eternal credit, raised his glass. He said, "Thank you, Natasha. That was..." He paused for 1 second. "That was genuinely one of the most heartfelt things anyone has said about us." And he drank. And the room drank. And the 6 seconds ended. But in those 6 seconds, I had learned something about the English language that 3 years of professional translation work and more novels than I could count had not taught me. I had learned that English words have 2 lives, the life they live in the dictionary and the life they live in the room. And those 2 lives are not always the same. The word I had used, the word I had looked up and chosen and placed at the end of my toast with confidence, was technically correct. It meant exactly what I thought it meant, in the formal definition of the word. But in a room of 200 British people at a wedding reception on a Saturday in June, it meant something else entirely. It meant something that made Sophie's mother put her hand over her mouth. It meant something that made the best man fight his expression. It was a word that British English had taken from its original meaning and redirected, specifically and firmly, into territory that no one expects to hear in the final line of a wedding toast. The word was randy, which in formal English means full of enthusiasm, vigorous, excited, and which in British English, in every room, in every context, without exception, means something considerably more physical. Sophie found me in the garden 20 minutes later. I was standing by a stone wall looking at the Surrey countryside in the specific way that a person looks at things when they are not actually seeing them. She said, "Natasha." I said, "I am so sorry." She said, "Stop." I said, "I researched it. I looked it up. The definition said, she said, "Natasha, stop." She was laughing, not the polite kind of laugh, the real kind, the kind that had been building for 20 minutes and had finally found a place to happen. She said, "Do you know what James said to me when we sat back down?" I said, "What?" She said, "He said, I think your Russian friend just gave the most honest toast anyone has ever given at a wedding." I looked at her. She said, "He wasn't wrong." She put her arm through mine. She said, "Come back inside. My aunt wants to meet the woman who said what everyone was thinking." We went back inside. I did not give another toast that evening, but I stayed until midnight and I danced and I ate the wedding cake. And at one point the best man came to find me and said, very quietly, very sincerely, "That was the funniest thing that has happened at a wedding I have attended in 15 years. I mean that as the highest possible compliment." I said, "I know what you mean. I checked." He laughed for a long time, and I thought, this is also English. Not the English of the dictionary, not the English of the novel, the English of the room, of the moment, of the specific human situation where the wrong word in the right company becomes something better than the right word would have been. I still think about that toast, not with embarrassment anymore, with something closer to gratitude. Because the 6 seconds of silence taught me something that 3 years of professional translation had not, that language is not a system for conveying meaning. It is a system for creating moments, and the moments are always more complicated and more alive than the words that make them. Sophie and James celebrated their 2nd anniversary last month. They sent me a card. On the inside, James had written one word, just one, and below it, in Sophie's handwriting, "We thought you'd appreciate the original meaning." The word was Randy. I laughed for a long time. Then I looked it up again. Vigorous, full of enthusiasm, excited. He was not wrong either. What I learned that evening and in the months that followed was a different kind of English education. Not the kind that comes from books. Not the kind that comes from classrooms or translation work or reading novels in their original language. The kind that comes from standing in a garden in Surrey looking at countryside you cannot see, while 200 people inside are talking about the word you just said. There are words in English that have what I began to call a double life. The first life is the one in the dictionary. Clean, historical, technically accurate. The life that a word lives on the page when no one is watching. The second life is the one in the room. Messy, alive, context dependent. The life that the same word lives when 200 people hear it simultaneously at a wedding reception. The gap between those two lives is where most people who speak excellent English still get lost. I began keeping a list, not of embarrassing words, though I kept those two separately for reasons of personal survival, but of the broader category. Words and phrases that meant one thing in formal English and something different. Sometimes opposite, sometimes sideways, sometimes just slightly angled. In the English that actual people spoke in actual rooms. The list became something I thought of as my real dictionary. The first entry, obviously, was Randy. Formal meaning, vigorous, enthusiastic, full of energy. Room meaning, do not use this word at a wedding. Do not use it at a funeral. Do not use it in a professional context. Do not, if you can avoid it, use it in a sentence at all until you have lived in Britain for at least 3 years and have developed an instinct for the specific expression on a British person's face that tells you the word you are about to say has a second life you may not be aware of. The second entry was quite. I had been using quite for years as a direct equivalent of the Russian dovolno, which means considerably. Very, to a significant degree. The project is quite complex, and I meant this project is considerably complex. Pay attention. Allocate resources accordingly. What I learned 8 months into my time in London was that British quite does not mean considerably. It means slightly, a bit. To a moderate degree that does not fully commit to the adjective it is modifying. The project is quite complex. British meaning the project has some complexity, but we are managing, and I do not wish to alarm you. I had been telling people that things were slightly challenging when I meant they were significantly challenging for 8 months. In a professional translation firm where precision was the entire point. My manager, when I explained this to him, carefully after I had verified it with 3 separate British colleagues, looked at me with the expression of someone who had just understood something that had been slightly puzzling them for a long time. He said, "That explains the Harrington contract." I said, "I told you it was quite difficult." He said, "Yes, and I thought you meant it was manageable." I said, "I meant it was nearly impossible." He said, "Natasha, why didn't you say it was nearly impossible?" I said, "I did. I said it was quite difficult." He looked at me. I looked at him. We sat with that for a moment. He said, "From now on, when something is very difficult, say very difficult." I said, "Not quite difficult?" He said, "Never quite difficult." I said, "Well, what if it is quite difficult, in the British sense?" He said, "And then say it's fine." I said, "Mom, fine means fine." He said, "Fine means it is not fine, but we are not going to discuss it." I looked at my list. I added, "fine." The third entry was, "I hear what you're saying." I had learned this phrase from a communication workshop the firm had organized in my second month. The workshop presenter, an enthusiastic man from Manchester who spoke about language with the energy of someone who had discovered something most people had missed, told us that "I hear what you're saying" was a useful phrase for acknowledging a colleague's perspective before offering a different one. I used it. I used it in a meeting. My colleague presented an approach to a project that I believed had a significant flaw. I waited for him to finish. I said, "I hear what you're saying." And then I explained the flaw. My colleague's expression changed. Not dramatically, subtly. The way British expressions change. Not a storm, a shift in weather. After the meeting, Sophie found me in the kitchen. She said, "Can I tell you something?" I said, "Yes." She said, "When you said 'I hear what you're saying' to Marcus in the meeting," I said, "The workshop said..." She said, "I know what the workshop said, but the way it landed, it sounded like you were dismissing him before you'd finished listening." I said, "But I had finished listening. He had finished speaking." She said, "I know, but 'I hear what you're saying' in British English has a specific tone. It's what people say when they've already decided they disagree, and they want you to know they're about to tell you why." I said, "But that's exactly what was happening." She said, "Yes, but in a meeting, you're not supposed to make that visible." I looked at her. She said, "Try 'That's a really interesting point' next time." I said, "But what if it isn't an interesting point?" She said, "That doesn't matter." I said, "I'm a translator. I have a professional relationship with accuracy." She said, "Natasha, you're also a person who has to work with Marcus every day." I added, "That's a really interesting point" to my list. Under the definition, I wrote, "Use when you disagree and want the other person to feel heard before you explain why they are wrong." The fourth entry was the one that took me the longest to understand. "Let's pick this up later." I had heard this phrase dozens of times in meetings. It seemed straightforward, a deferral, an agreement to continue a conversation at a future point. I waited for the future point. It did not come. Not once. Not in 8 months of meetings. Not in a single instance of someone saying, "Let's pick this up later," did the conversation ever get picked up. I finally asked Sophie, I said, "What does 'let's pick this up later' mean?" She said, "It means the meeting is over and we're not going to talk about this anymore." I said, "Then why doesn't anyone say that?" She thought about this for a moment. She said, "Because saying, 'we're not going to talk about this anymore' sounds final. And British people don't like things to sound final. They like things to sound postponed. It's more comfortable. I said, but it's not postponed. It's finished. She said, yes. I said, so it's a lie. She said, it's a social agreement. I said, what's the difference? She said, everyone knows it's not true, so it can't be a lie. A lie requires at least one person to be deceived. I looked at her. She said, welcome to British English. I added, let's pick this up later to my list. Definition: this conversation is over. Do not wait for a follow-up. Do not send a reminder email. Do not say in the next meeting, I wanted to pick up where we left off. This will cause visible discomfort. I showed Sophie the list one evening in November. We were in a pub in Greenwich, the kind of pub that has been there since before anyone can remember and intends to remain. And I ordered her a drink and put the notebook on the table. She read through it slowly. When she finished, she looked up. She said, "This is extraordinary." I said, "Is it accurate?" She said, "It's more accurate than anything I've ever read about how we actually talk." She turned a page. She said, "You should publish this." I said, "It's a personal list." She said, "Natasha, this is not a personal list. This is a field guide to British English written by someone who had to survive it." I looked at the notebook. I thought about the wedding toast, about Randy and its second life, about 6 seconds of silence in a room of 200 people, about James raising his glass and Sophie's laughter in the garden, and the best man finding me to say it was the funniest thing he had seen at a wedding in 15 years. I thought about the distance between the English I had brought with me and the English I had found here. I said, "I still get it wrong sometimes." Sophie said, "Everyone gets it wrong sometimes." I said, "Not at weddings." She laughed. She said, "Actually, you'd be surprised." She took my glass and went to the bar. I sat in the pub in Greenwich, in a city that was not the city I had come from, in a language that was not the language I had thought it was, and I felt not lost, not found exactly. Something in between. Present. That was the word. I felt present in the room, which I had come to understand was the whole point. Not to sound like someone who had been born here. Not to eliminate the distance between the English in my head and the English in the room, but to close it. Enough. To be in the room fully enough that when I said something wrong, the room could hold it, could turn it into something, could take the 6 seconds of silence and fill them with something better than embarrassment. I went back to St. Petersburg once, in the second year. My mother asked me how my English was. I said, "It depends which English you mean." She said, "There's more than one?" I said, "There are as many as there are rooms." She looked at me the way mothers look at children who have returned from somewhere and brought back something that cannot quite be named. She said, "Are you happy there?" I looked out the window at the canal. In winter, it froze. In summer, it reflected the sky. I said, "I'm present there, which I've decided is better." She thought about this for a long time. Then she said, "Your grandmother used to say something like that." I said, "What did she say?" She said, "Whoa." She said, "Don't ask if you belong somewhere. Ask if you're paying attention." I looked at the canal. I thought about 6 seconds of silence. I thought about a word with 2 lives. I thought about a list in a notebook that had started as a record of mistakes and become something else entirely. I said, "Tell grandmother she was right." My mother said, "She died 4 years ago." I said, "I know, tell her anyway." Outside St. Petersburg in winter, the canal, frozen, and above it, the same sky that was above London, just seen from a different window. I came back to London on a Sunday. Monday morning, I walked into the office. My manager was standing at my desk. He said, "I was about to call you." I said, "What happened?" He said, "The Volkov Industries account." I went completely still. Volkov is a common Russian name. like Smith in English, like Chen in Chinese. I had told myself this when the account first appeared on the company roster 6 months earlier. I had told myself it was a coincidence. He said, "Their lead representative has requested you specifically, by name." I said, "I don't know anyone at Volkov Industries." He looked at me. He said, "He says you'll understand why he asked for you when you see him." I said, "What's his name?" My manager looked at the paper. He said, "Dmitry Volkov." I set my bag down very carefully, because Dmitry Volkov was not a coincidence. Dmitry Volkov was the reason I had left St. Petersburg on a specific Tuesday in March and decided that the life I wanted could not be built where I was standing. He had found me, in London, through a translation firm in Canary Wharf, using a name I had spent 2 years trying to forget. My manager said, "He arrives Thursday." I said, "I'll be ready." I sat at my desk. I opened my notebook to the last page. I picked up my pen, and I wrote one final entry. Not a word with 2 lives. Not a phrase that means something different in the room. Just a question. 3 words. The 3 words that Dmitry Volkov had said to me on the last night in St. Petersburg before I packed 2 suitcases and bought a one-way ticket and decided to become someone who lived in a city that faced a park instead of a canal. I stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then I closed the notebook. Thursday was 3 days away, and some things cannot be translated. They can only be survived.